Hello and welcome to this joint Elephants Don't Forget and Worksmart webinar where we discuss with subject matter experts and leading authorities the key issues that are impacting and affecting firms. My name is Philip Allen and I'm delighted to welcome you to this 60-minute webinar on avoiding culture and conduct fatigue. I'm joined by two recent survivors of Black Friday and Cyber Monday in Julie Pardy, Director of Regulation and Market Engagement from SMCR software firm Worksmart, and Adrian Harvey from the AI-powered knowledge retention firm Elephants Don't Forget. This is an interactive webinar, and if you've been in any of our webinars before, that we do like a conversation via the chat function, which you can see denoted by the speech bubble on the top toolbar of your menu, or the speech bubbles in the Q&A session. Please note that when you do respond to any of the comments or questions that we pose to you, you can do so anonymously in the Q&A. But if you just want to comment and give us feedback on what you hear and what other of your peers are saying, please do so in the speech bubble and where it says chat there. And as I said before, we'll send a recording and a copy of the slide decks to you by the end of the week. And you can subscribe to regulatory updates from both Elephants Don't Forget and Worksmart direct to your email inbox straight after the webinar by indicating your preferences there as well. What we do want to cover is 4 key issues that you see on the screen there, but I'm very conscious of the time that we've got, lots to get through. Obviously, this is a wrap up of what's happened in the last year, last 12 months, but it also a look forward to what conduct and culture looks like in your firm in 2022. So we'll be touching base on these issues to achieve a state of continual cultural compliance, the tools that the FCA will be using to address conduct and culture in your firm, how the regulator will view conduct and culture in your firm in 2022, and also more importantly, how do you get on top of this very critical issue that the regulator is again emphasizing again and again this year and certainly into the next year there. But we wanted to kickstart proceedings off by really asking you, and I hope you've got your coffees mugs charged with this, an interesting question that both Julie, myself and Adrian were discussing prior to the webinar is how confident do you feel, would you describe your firm's culture and conduct journey to the regulator? So how confident would you feel in describing your firm's conduct and culture to the regulator there? So it would be great if you could participate in the poll there. We've got a series of questions there which you can answer, 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 8, and 9 to 10. So it'd be great to get your feedback and response from there. I don't know if you can see that on the screen, Adrian and Julie now.
Yes, we can.
See. Okay, right.
Yep.
Okay, right.
Yeah. And it will be interesting, and it'd be really good, wouldn't it, to have some commentary from firms as well, rather than just a straight score. It would be really interesting in the chat just to understand, so what is it about what you're doing that makes you feel that you're at that point, or what you're not doing that makes you feel at that point? And very specifically, those organizations that might sit in the 9 to 10 category, fantastic. You know, what can you share that will help others in the industry about your journey? Because, you know, it really is a journey, isn't it? And I think this is the thing, you know, the regulator's looking for progression here, not just a, you know, once in a year check or once in a 2-year check of where the firm is. It's where you come from and where you're going to.
And I think this is, I just want to emphasize that this is strictly in confidence, that your the results of this poll won't be shared with anybody there, but it gives us a sense check of where you are as an organization, as a firm, and also as a simple part, Adrian, of benchmarking and benchmarking what's out there currently in the sector and what does good look like. So as Julie said, those people have indicated 9 to 10. Please share with us what you are doing and how other firms can follow suit in that. So let's have a look at the poll results.
At the risk of being contentious, Philip, at the risk of being contentious, I wonder if you pose the same question to the regulator, what the mix would be that they would anticipate. I suspect it wouldn't be that 92% of the market scored 4 and above.
So, well, here are the answers. 59% of firms on this webinar say that you indicate 7 to 8 that conduct and culture systems and controls are in place. Julie, in your experience of working closely with firms implementing SMCR and introducing SMCR software to firms, is that what you see in general?
I think in the majority, we see a lot of firms and their employees working really, really hard to do the right thing. Sometimes being challenged, especially over the last couple of years around the way that we've been working and the remote nature of working. So I think it has been really difficult for firms, but we've certainly seen lots of progress. It's also worth making a comment about one of the statements in the chat, which is exactly what we were talking about earlier, and we were talking about this fact that when times are hard, either financially or in other ways within firms, one of the things that tends to happen is that educational piece is cut very quickly. But one of our individuals that I think scored 9 to 10 has said one of the key things is all about education, and couldn't agree with that more.
Adrian, 36% of firms indicating a score of 6 or less, though, with conduct risk maybe being identified but not acted upon, and some firms indicating a little or no understanding of what drives poor conduct and culture in their firm.
It doesn't surprise me. I think the number of people registered and attending this webinar indicate just how important a topic this is, and I suspect there is a general need to understand better what firms can do, and most of the compliance professionals that I speak with on a weekly basis are genuinely curious and asking the question, what more can we or should we be doing, because at the moment this is all we've got. So I think there's not quite a cry for help, but I definitely sense a mood in the market, or certainly the compliance and regulatory marketplace, that says, what more can we be doing? So I'm sort of surprised at the 7 to 8, the number of firms, 60% of firms in the 7 to 8, given my first-hand experience of speaking to people privately.
And we're talking about causes of conduct and culture fatigue, and we put this illustration here that for many firms it seems like a never-ending game of whack-a-mole. First, as soon as you solve one compliance issue, a new regulation is introduced or an existing one changes. Julie, that's a continued challenge and an issue that firms are sharing with yourself, aren't they? That where do they turn? What do they do? What's important? What's a priority? What's less of a priority in firms?
Yeah, I mean, it's all right for us to observe how firms are getting on, but genuinely within regulated organisations at the moment, I think it's hugely challenging. I was just going through and looking at all of the different regulators that touch financial services firms, and whether they are driving legislative change, changing the legislation, or actually applying the regulation. I mean, I got to HM Treasury, Bank of England, PRA, FCA, Payment Services Regulator, Competition and Markets Authority, Pensions Regulator, Financial Reporting Council, Information Commissioner's Office. Now, it may not be that everybody is directly covered by all of those, depending on what their regulatory permissions are and what sector they sit in. But actually, if you're a team within an organisation, if you're the leadership team trying to drive the business forward, and you've got your support, your second and third line support teams helping guide you in terms of what, how things are appearing in the market and what you need to do next, it's not surprising people are really tired. Actually, there comes a point where there's only so many initiatives that teams, individuals and firms can handle, and I think from a regulatory perspective there is a lot of fatigue out there at the moment, as you say.
Yes, and I'll be interested if people could post in the chat whether they think that what are the causes potentially of conduct fatigue or culture fatigue in their firm or in the sector. Is it what Julie is saying? Is it just literally the sheer volume of regulation that they have to manage? or is it something else that is driving that? Adrian, from a training and learning perspective, so easy, isn't it, for conduct and culture to be a tick box e-learning approach, isn't it? And therefore, suggests that it's just another compliance issue, and therefore gets treated like another compliance issue, in the fact that, potentially, and I'm not saying this is exactly true for all firms, but the very training that firms put into place, rather than minimizing culture and conduct, might be actually driving the wrong behaviors that you want to see in an organization.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I read this document and I had a headache at the end of it, and it's the most enormous. And you look at it, and just to be fair to every firm out there who's regulated, there's the most enormous amount of work there, and to some extent you can understand why firms might take a more tick the box type approach to as much of the regulatory compliance stuff as they can, because there's simply so much to do. However, your point, I think, is really valid, because if as a firm you pursue a strategy for employee training and competency, for example, that is sort of the default tick box approach, your employees will judge you on that basis. They will judge your firm in relation to how seriously are you taking this, if this is how you train us to ensure that we are competent. And I suspect that judgment won't be overly favourable.
And it's worth reminding, Julie, of the FCA's culture expectations and requirements here. And when we look at this infographic here, we've got 6 drivers of that behavior and that culture within that they're expecting. And number 1, we talk about tone from the top, but increasingly I'm hearing messages from the regulator and from industry experts that it's actually tone from within. And I want to focus, and I know you've got some hot off the press intel that you want to share with us. The second point here on the right hand side of this infographic on purpose, and purpose is what Jonathan Davison, the FCA's Executive Director of Supervision, spoke about in March of this year, talking about purposeful cultures. But you've also got hot off the press this morning from Peter Ewing from the FCA, really unpacking that a bit further.
Yeah, I think there's a number of comments to make here. So I've just come from the TISA second annual culture conference, and I was speaking after Peter Ewing and had the opportunity to ask a few questions of Peter and regulatory expectations. And there was a real focus in Peter's talk about purpose, and purpose driving culture, as it were. So if you look at SMCR as the regulatory framework and the potential tools that allow people to build and progress their cultures, that purpose was a really important part of that. He talked about, he sampled an example of an interesting purpose statement from an organisation, and that was IKEA, because it's very clear as to what they're there to achieve. And I think the point was where, and this goes to your tone from the top to tone from within, where everybody within an organisation is very clear what their raison d'etre is. Actually, it's easier to align culturally the behaviours that you want to make sure that that's delivered. But one of the things that I did ask Peter was, go on then, tell us about these cultural audits then. We keep on hearing about these cultural audits, and they were going to be 2021, now they're going to be 2022. What's this all about? And he actually said, I'm really glad you asked that question. I don't know where this has come from. I don't know who started this. There isn't a point in time at which we're going to go to the industry and go, right, everybody fill in a questionnaire and tell us about your culture, because that just doesn't work. But what he did say was, and I think this is really important for firms to understand and understand the implications for them, that whether they are a firm-specific supervised firm, i.e. you've got your own set of supervisors because of your size and importance, or whether you are portfolio-led supervised, they are developing and continue to develop their approach so that culture is a part, and cultural discussions and assessment are part of everything that they do with that firm. So it's not, we're going to rock up on Monday morning and you've got 20 questions that you need to answer. What they're interested in is, what have you done? Why have you done it? How's it gone? What didn't go very well? What did go well? What measures are you using out of interest? Why are you using those? What ones did you choose not to use? How have you found that? Has it given you the right information that you need? I could go on and on and on, but I won't. So it's those kind of conversations where they're not interested in well, 25% of people said that and 42% of people said that. Well, actually, that's a bit harsh. It's not that they're not interested. They want to understand the narrative around that and what you're doing with the information that you've got, why you think it's relevant, why it's not, and how you're moving through. And I thought that was a very grown up and sensible approach to these discussions.
And whilst, oh, brilliant, Adrian, you're back with us again. Thank you for that. What are the things I want to pick up on? And I want to pose the question to you, Adrian. The FCA makes it very clear that it's focusing on purpose, and they're very clear that an unhealthy culture really leads from an unhealthy purpose as being the root cause of, say, mis-selling and conduct scandals in the past. It makes it more important, more so than ever before, really, that your approach to training supports that cultural drive and that those values and those objectives and purpose. And in the past we've had a tick box approach to, say, conduct rules training, and in 2022 that is not going to float, from what Julie said, with the regulator anymore.
I'm terribly sorry, Philip. I was offline for a considerable part of your conversations. I haven't heard much. Can you just précis that for me? And I'll
absolutely. So basically what I'm saying is that to uphold the expectations of the regulator on their expectations on purpose and culture, you need training to support that positive culture there. And the critical thing for firms, and I think that firms that have indicated it in their responses to the positive questions on indicated 9 and 10 in their first poll question here, indicated that their training was continually improving, continually being refreshed, continually not being at a point in time, but a regular ongoing activity.
Yeah, well, it needs to be continual. Single point in time just simply doesn't work. I think probably most of the people on the webinar would accept that. What we find is that firms often struggle to translate theoretical training, to practical application in role for the employee, capability and competence. That tends to be, so most firms would say, look, we've got it covered. We're delivering training to our people en masse is relatively straightforward. That, however, is not necessarily what's required. What's required is capable and competent individuals, and that's what we see as being a challenge for a lot of firms.
And it'll be interesting to see what tools, as Adrian said, are you as an organization using to measure and assess your conduct and culture? And so we've just posed a number of different options here. Are you using annual staff surveys, employee interviews, analyzing quantitative data that you have, or others? It'd be great to knowledge share with each other about what you're using in your firm, and also, what's working and what's not working. There, we've got our own views, obviously, on that, but really wanted to know what your feedback is on this. And Julie, the Bank of England has their own feedback, doesn't it, on some of these measures and some of these measures that companies and organizations are using. Some are more favorable than others.
Yeah, well, I think the PRA have done a lot of research and a lot of research in the behavioural space about what happens when you use certain types of tools, which is why there'll always be this piece around suggesting that organisations take a number of touch points to take the temperature, as it were, because what they'll say is that, you know, whilst traditionally that annual staff survey would be seen as the culture or the key cultural indicator within the firm, that actually that there are some risks in doing that, and that is because of the typical things. So timing, depending on when you time that, if it's near pay rises or bonuses, then you might get a skewed result. You'll have individuals within organisations that don't believe it's anonymous, and therefore they will only give you positive results as to how they really feel. And then you'll get others that, for whatever reason, have real issues with certain things, and you'll get a skewed view. So the research suggests that actually, whilst that historically might have been seen as a good thing, then there is, you know, it's time to sort of spread out and look at other measurements and see how firms can expand that database of information to try and get a more accurate picture of where they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see. Just building on Julie's point, I see this like a, you know, those Trivial Pursuit counter things that have little cheeses that you put in it, and I to use the analogy, I liken it to organisations have got to take many different measures and bring it together in a single coherent way. One measure in itself, like an annual staff survey, is not appropriate. And what's good to see through some of the chat is some of the actions that firms are taking to gather data from different sources, because it's got to be continual and it's got to be multifaceted.
And it's fantastic. Some people have name-checked tools, which I'm very familiar with in the chat as well. So good knowledge sharing with both organisations. No doubt that many of you are using Worksmarts and Elephants. Don't forget organisational capabilities and the resources and the software applications that they have there. But we wanted to now focus on what tools what tools do you use, but also what the regulator will be using to assess your firm's culture. And Julie, our audience, as we've said before, will be familiar with Tone from the Top, individual accountability. It's been with us for a number of years now, but we talk about Tone from within. And that means requiring every person in the organization to be personal, accountable and engaged. Easier said than done. I get that there. But do you see that shift that people are really adopting, or organizations are adopting the individual accountability very, very seriously indeed, given the raft of regulation and FCA announcements over the last 6 or 7 months? Is that being adopted from the top still, or is that being actually accepted as a responsibility from within the firm?
I think there's a growing body of evidence that says that whilst historically Tone from the Top was the language of the regulator and it was the expectation within firms, that there's a realisation, especially with dispersed working, that there has to be more accountability at an individual level of the part that we all play within the culture of a firm. I think if you think about it, when we looked at SMCR, when that came in 2016 in banking, they had cultural prescribed responsibilities. So I think there was one for the chairman around the culture of the board, and there was one for either the CEO or the senior leadership team around the culture of the organisation. That's all fine, but actually there are a lot of parts within that. So there was some recent research that I was looking at from Harvard around this, and they were saying that, look, that Tone from the Top approach to building that culture that you want is going to struggle to work going forward for a number of reasons. COVID being one of them, dispersed working, the growing importance to regulators of this topic, and also just experience, and that they categorise different levels of individual within organisations, all the way through from your board and your non-executive, all the way through to every single employee that works for the organisation. So that's a lot of words to say. Basically, everybody is accountable for culture, and the organisation, needs to educate staff in line with the conduct rules that apply to everybody as to why we're all in this together. And the greater level of education that you can give people, the greater understanding, the more likely to get the commitment to actually work through on that type of approach.
And worth saying to the audience here that Mark Stewart, the Executive Director of Enforcement and Market Oversight at the FCA, said in April 2021 about tone from above, he said himself that controls and leadership can get you so far, reinforcing that Harvard research paper. And he said that the point of failure is not necessarily a failure of compliance, it's human nature that is the real challenge. And he was citing a case of a compliance officer who was very intelligent, very experienced in an organization, in a financially regulated firm, that made questionable decisions and choices, even though that she was expected to adhere to the highest standards of competence and conduct there. And again, don't want to labor the point, traditional compliance learning has to support not only the knowledge transfer, Adrian, and have an approach that addresses what financial misconduct could look like or would look like, but it's actually helping and supporting people of understanding what good looks like in a firm, and learning has to reinforce that behavior and that cultural mindset on an individual level, not just on an exco or a board level.
Yeah, I mean, I always use the analogy about cybersecurity. All of us have done various cybersecurity training, I'm sure, and almost all of this training that I've come across looks at the theory, and you get through it, you tick the box, and then you get back on with your work. And cybersecurity is still probably one of the biggest threats facing every organisation on this webinar, because employees can't translate that theory to their day-to-day job. And this runs through all types of training. What's required by the employer is to help the employee understand how that theory translates to enroll real life scenarios, and that needs to be unfortunately at an individual level.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Sorry, just to bring your attention to it, there's a great quote in the chat that actually exactly talks to that point, Adrian. So Andrew, thank you for this comment. He's talking about the fact that they're bringing to life the conduct rules when they're observing their staff in live observations, and they're actually referencing their behaviour against the conduct rules within the debrief after the event. You know, that's great. When we talk about training and competence, or the wider topic of employee competence, it's the application, and the regulator's been saying this for the last few years. Don't do just e-learning about conduct rules. You need to do it in the context of the role and what's good and what's not. So I think that's a great example of a firm and an organisation bringing that to life.
Blue Peter badges are issues. Yeah. Go on, Adrian.
It's a hugely powerful method, and full credit to you. It's what will work.
Both of you, the audience should be familiar, and hopefully familiar, with the 5 conduct questions that have really helped over the last few years focus the minds of senior managers, and certainly we'll post in the chat a link to the FCA's 5 conduct questions. But Julie and Nikhil is asking the sector's feedback currently on a 6th conduct question around D&I. Now, obviously, that's been talked about a lot, especially over COVID, and since experiences and events have happened in the US. But this is a very serious point, and one that firms should be really alive to in 2022. Do you want to just unpack that a little bit more on D&I and the proposed 6th conduct question?
Yeah, and this was picked up again by Peter Ewing at this event this morning, and he was saying how very important it is to the regulator. And it's not just because they've got a thing about this at the moment, it's because all of the statistical evidence shows that where you have a diverse workforce, you have a more effective one. And if you think about where the regulator's coming from, they're coming from the fact that they have strategic and operational objectives, and they're all around making sure that the financial system is stable and that there's good competition and consumers are protected. And so from their perspective, they want diversity, within organisations, firstly, because actually when they've got diversity of thinking, they know that invariably you end up getting better business results, and you tend to have lower levels of risk. That's what the research will tell you. And secondly, this inclusivity thing around, we should be able to work in a culture where it is okay to stand up and say you've seen something that is wrong, or you believe to be wrong, or you don't feel comfortable about, and that actually that shouldn't mean that that makes you a bad person. So there's, you know, the D&I space, I think, from they're consulting on it. If we look at the Regulatory Initiative Grid, the PRA and the FCA are consulting around diversity and inclusivity, and looking at how they might be being more focused in this area, where they might look for more data from firms. But actually, going back to that PRA report that you referenced earlier, they're already picking up what diversity data they can from the regulatory pre-approvals that they do. So they're already tracking age, gender, tenure in certain type of roles, turnover, that kind of thing. So this is a continuation of what's already started.
And I'm glad, Julie, you've picked up on that point, because Adrian, we've talked a number of times that diversity is not just about race or gender, it's about neurodiversity, and the regulator is wanting to focus on that to avoid challenges to culture, which is including groupthink. And you know, and making sure that, you know, you don't have yes men and women at the top or in the organization, throughout the organization, because that could actually create issues of social silence, and that I'm hearing that term a lot recently. You've picked up on that, about the fact that diversity should mean a lot more things across the whole organization. Do you want to just unpack that a bit?
Oh, God, that's put me on the spot. I'm not sure I can.
Sorry.
I was going to say I agree with you, Philip, and then you've been posed a really difficult question. So I agree.
Okay, right. Well, when something when what you might not agree with, because we've had this debate constantly, is the working from home arrangements. Now I'm thinking off the top of my head now. So the FCA expects to test your firm's remote working arrangements forensically, and quite rightly so. And you've always been quiet about the working from home issue, haven't you, Adrian?
Yes, I've been silent on it, Philip. Yes, after the
especially
LinkedIn hatred. I actually am a work from home advocate, and I have done for a decade. But this is an interesting point, I think, because one of the conversations that we've had in the past is, and Julie and I in particular, is what's changed, irrespective of whether you're pro work from home or not. It's slightly academic. Most of the firms on this webinar will either have a large number of employees working from home, or they will have some sort of hybrid arrangement. And I guess my question would be, what's changed in relation to your employee training and competence to reflect that material adjustment to the working environment of your employees? And if the answer is, well, not very much, I seriously think that in itself is a red flag. And if I were the regulator, my first question in relation to employee training competency would be, please talk me through what's changed as a result of COVID, and you shipping your workforce all over or distributed workforce rather than in a central place. So, and most firms, I think, that I speak with will say, well, not a great deal materially has changed.
And one of the things, Julie, I picked up from a law firm in the city were that, and they posed the question: are employees of regulated firms aware of the FCA's ability to visit any address from where services are provided, and that includes residential addresses? Have firms assessed that risk of not only just working from home, but having regulatory visits to your home?
Genuinely, I don't think so, is my honest answer to that. I think there's, if you look at the rules and the rule books, and you follow up on that FCA statement about that they made about home working and what it meant to them in the context of their supervision of the market. One of the key things is that firms have got to be effectively structured so they can be supervised effectively from a regulatory perspective. So I guess when you look at it in some detail, it's probably not a surprise that they've actually said that, but were people thinking about it in that context before they said it? I suspect not. But the most important thing here, I think, is the bit that Adrian was talking about here. It's the change. So many organisations, such as, you know, ours at Worksmart, such as Adrian's, ADF, you know, we have, like many financial services firms, had many people working from home for a very long time before the pandemic. So we would have policies and procedures and controls in place that manage and mitigate the risk of the way that those people worked. But if you're a regulated business and you didn't, and then you switch to that, then that's where the area of interest is. So what, as Adrian said, so what changed? So what review of policies and procedures? What additional steps did you put in processes? What additional oversight? How did you tell the staff? How did you train them? How did you ensure that they understood what you were saying? And that's the bit where they're going to challenge, and that's where they'll talk to the firm's culture. So is your culture to tell people, but not work with them to help them understand what that means in the context of them and their role? So it's really difficult, I think, really difficult for firms.
And as we see on point number 4, same expectations but different circumstances when we're working from home. Many of the firms on this webinar will be focusing on operational resilience and making sure that their plans are in adherence to the expectation, the hard stop deadline in March of next year. But resilience is by design, and starts with a resilient culture, Adrian, doesn't it? We can talk about cyber defense and IT recovery and continuity, third-party resilience, but you have to have resilient culture, and that means resilient individuals with a set of values, beliefs, and behaviors that drive that resilient culture, that supports that operational resilience in organizations. Going back to what you were talking about, how your approach to cybersecurity training needs to perhaps be changed or challenged.
Yeah, and you know, my stuck record is about how firms learning strategy, if you like, most firms would accept that their learning strategy is out of kilter with how people learn nowadays. Yeah, so most people learn through understanding what they're not good at and filling those gaps, rather than all consuming the same content irrespective of their levels of capability. So resilience for me comes from individuals knowing, yeah, they are competent. Yeah, so, and seeing affirmations rather than somebody just saying, yes, you're good at that. Seeing factual affirmations on a regular basis that they are competent in their role, and that builds resilience throughout the organisation.
I want to move on to a key topic because of whistleblowing, because in March the FCA launched its In Confidence with Confidence campaign, and the aim, and I think this was really important for firms on this webinar, was if you don't recall that that launch, was to encourage employees and ex-employees of FS firms to report potential wrongdoing directly to the regulator, and that was inviting those employees to participate and to speak up and speak out, but also ex-employees of firms and reporting of potential wrongdoing, and even cited family members and close friends and neighbours being able to whistleblow if and when appropriate. And we pulled out these figures, and this is a Freedom of Information request that was submitted by Regulatory Intelligence, and quite interesting statistics that you see here. On the left-hand side, you see that the whistleblowing allegations in 2020, top of the polls there was compliance 525 allegations that were made to the regulator. FMP 384, TCF 314, and systems and control 219 there. But what's interesting, there's a second bullet point on the right-hand side, 211 allegations classified by the regulator, citing culture of an organization in 2020. And Julie, I'm just wondering whether whistleblowing is now the new lens, or one of the lenses that they're really looking at as an assessment tool to look at how your culture is within your firm.
Without a shadow of a doubt, I'm sure it's part of it. But again, it's that balance, isn't it, about why people are doing that. I think out of all of those numbers there, that's an awful lot around culture of an organisation, which probably is just reaffirmed to them that they need to continue doing the work that they're doing around the importance of it. But it doesn't surprise me that you'll have situations, and quite often some of them will be just misunderstandings, lack of information, maybe people acting in a certain way because they perceive that to be the right way, because they haven't been trained properly, because they don't have effective training and competence and employee competence schemes. There's a whole variety of reasons as to why this might be the case. But I think it's part of that, when we talked about that picture, not just picking on one point, having a variety of measures. And I think there's a few comments, actually. There was one that I was reading when you were talking there earlier. It was Elizabeth, and she was talking about, from their cultural lens, they've got this dashboard that has all of this different stuff. It's got behavioural stuff, it's got data points, it's got interview-led activities. So I think, yes, the regulator is going to use this as part of what they look at, but it's only part of the picture that we've been trying to build up here. And I think there's a lot of firms that have already got their component parts in place to try and help them move forward in this space.
And I want to point people to the last bullet point on the right-hand side that talks about the 130 whistleblowing reports there. And if people are not familiar with SIC 18, it sets out the requirements for firms to have an internal whistleblowing process. And so these 132 complaints potentially are likely to be about the failure of a firm's internal handling of reports from whistleblowers themselves. So it's a real urgency for organizations to review and improve for 2022 their approach to building and improving their approach to psychological safety. And I know that you've got a background, Adrian, in energy. That whistleblowing and has a different place, doesn't it, within the culture of an organization. And it's encouraged because there's so much at risk if things go wrong.
Yeah, I've spoken on webinars before, so apologies. I do seem to be cutting in and out of the webinars. I think we've got some internet instability. Yes, I think there's a lot to be learned from the sort of health and safety culture from all sorts of firms in the UK, but I've had a lot of experience in the energy sector, and how that translates, or should and could translate, to regulatory culture, because certainly in the energy organisations I've worked with, E.ON case in point, it is actively encouraged. So the first thing on every agenda is employee safety. And it's not just a tick box, it's every day, every meeting, every online session starts with employee safety. Yeah. And if you applied that same mindset to, for example, treating customers fairly, what would be different in your organization? And it is actually just a decision for a firm to decide that's what we're going to do, and then implement it. And there are many tools that you can use to help you do that.
Yes, I want to point people to our sixth point, which is bottom right, non-financial misconduct, and really draw you to the attention of the current interim CEO of the Financial Ombudsman Service, Nasia Delfas, who said earlier this year that non-financial misconduct will be a clear example of driving unhealthy culture. And we've seen the regulator, the FCA in this case, certainly take action against an individual. You may have heard of it, the case against Mr. Frensham, recently, a financial advisor who got struck off for life because of his misconduct issue, non-financial misconduct. And the case is quite interesting. We won't go into too much detail about it, but we can send the links to that. But it sends a very clear warning to firms that non-financial misconduct, and we go back to Megan Butler's speech in 2018, where she says non-financial misconduct is misconduct, full stop, there. And it was interesting that whilst Mr. Frensham was convicted of sexual grooming offences, he did not commit the offence at or through his work and it did not involve dishonesty, the FCA sought to prohibit him because he was no longer unfit and proper as he lacked integrity. Now, Mr. Frenchman challenged that decision in the tribunal, claiming that the FCA had applied its F&P test in allowing irrelevant considerations, he believed, to affect its judgment and failing to give sufficient regard to other factors. However, the tribunal agreed with the FCA in saying that his failure to notify the FCA that he'd been arrested and remanded in custody in respect to the offence, his failure to notify the FCA that and also the CII that he was a member of, and who declined to renew his membership of professional standing, and also his lack of remorse for his actions. Julie, this case really emphasises that non-financial misconduct, it sits in the remit of the regulator, but when you're assessing F&P of individuals, that individuals have to be very transparent and honest. And that what considers your private life might not actually have the same opinions, but share the same opinions as the regulator themselves.
Yeah, and I think that there's this one, and there's been a couple of other high-profile ones where conduct outside of work has impacted. And I think it's fascinating that people should think that conduct outside of work of a serious nature that leads to a conviction, regardless of that conviction, doesn't mean that your fitness and propriety shouldn't be called into question. It should be considered. I'm not saying what the outcome should be, but I think the point here is it's that open, it's that honest, and then it's that decision about, if this person was prepared to, and he was convicted, prepared to break the law, then what is that likely to translate to in his working life? So regardless of the fact that it didn't happen on their premises. And I think some of the other high profile cases, had similar issues. But I think there's an interesting comment again in the chat, and it's from Claire, and it talks about, we're going to be doing annual reporting on conduct rules breaches, and that will obviously help the regulator get that cultural barometer. I absolutely agree. It might be worth looking at what the PRA say about their view of that. So they published a review of SMCR in banking. They published the number of conduct rule breaches reported, I think, for senior managers and for other staff. They didn't comment on whether it was too many or not enough or there or thereabouts, because that would be impossible to say. But it's just interesting to view their comments. So yeah, I absolutely agree. This outside of work piece, you cannot separate integrity outside of work and inside of work, seems to be what's coming out of these cases, and that it will be a consideration for the regulator to take into account when deciding whether they feel that you can continue in a particular role, should you have issues like this outside of your working life.
And the accountability is obviously with the individual to disclose, but is it also making sure that the firm is asking the right questions, and looking at, are there systemic issues here? What can we do to prevent such things? What positive, changes can we encourage employees to share there? Is that there's the individual accountability, but also the firm's responsibility, isn't it, to draw that information out and then therefore to present it to the regulator?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of processes here, isn't there? There's a number of processes around information, around education, absolutely, to the regulator's point around you need to not just let people do e-learning. They need to have proper conversations about real life scenarios and debate what that means in the context of the firm. You need to have really strong governance processes that people are aware of and they understand, so that they understand what type of issues they should be reporting and therefore what should be discussed. And should they choose not to report those, then obviously that compounds the issue, I suspect. So it's a combination, I think, of policy, procedure, education, governance and oversight. But at the end of the day, if somebody doesn't want to declare something, that they're not going to, and part of the process in SMCR and part of the requirements around criminal records checking and annual assessments and midterm assessments are all there and put in place to try and manage and mitigate exactly things like this.
Yes, and we've posed some questions here on the screen that the regulator might be asking you in 2022, but it might be a sense check against what you've got currently in your risk control framework around conduct and culture. And I don't know whether, I know that Adrian's dropping in and out, so Adrian, jump in if you can see the screen and you've got comms back again with us. But
Comms up.
yep, fantastic. Don't know whether Julie and yourself could just pick up one question on this slide, and maybe the audience could pick up other questions that really you think firms need to be on, absolutely zeroed in on over the next 12, 13 months also.
Oh, that's really,
Go on.
Oh, sorry, go on, Adrian.
No, I say you go first.
Oh, I was going to say that's really hard.
You can take all of the above.
I don't think I can pick one of those questions, because actually I think it's a combination of things, really. This is really, really difficult, isn't it? Because we were talking about this earlier on, and in a crisis, whether it be a pandemic that we've been in or a financial crisis, there is an immediate reaction in many organisations that we see to tighten the purse strings, where you'd say, well, that's sensible, but sometimes to the point where all of the stuff, I'll say stuff in general terms, that you need to do to support your employees across all of these pieces, if the funding goes and you don't have the time or the level of support to be given to this, it really negatively impacts the firm. So I suspect the regulator will want to know what's different, what's changed, what are you doing more of, what are you doing less of, to try and get that picture about where the firm's going in terms of support in all these different areas.
Philip, I'd reiterate that I speak to lots of compliance and risk professionals, and I don't think any of them say that we're embarrassed by riches and the amount of budget that we're given to make sure that the business is complying comprehensively. I hear the opposite. Our budget's been cut. We don't get enough to do what we want to do. So, and I think that's reflective of a culture that perhaps isn't treating the regulations seriously as the regulator wants, and isn't going to drive a culture of treating customers fairly.
Yes, I'll be interested to know also, as the audience, on what questions are they expecting the regulator to ask them of their systems and their controls and their approaches to conduct and culture in 2022. It'll be interesting to see whether they differ from the questions that we have posted here. And last 10 minutes of the webinar, I really wanted to put this slide over, because it's critical that what we've said, the expectation on regulated firms, Julian and Adrian, to adhere to increasing expectations, shifting expectations, more regulation, and tightening budgets, that they need a process and a framework to continually improve their approach to conduct and cultures. It's not a nice to have, it's surely now in 2022 a must have.
Yeah, and as you were talking earlier on, I was writing myself a question, and there are many different views on this, and the question I was asking myself is regulatory compliance a taxation spend or a business enabler? And it goes back to your tick box comments earlier, that we can choose to do things just because we have to, or we can choose to do things given the right time, space, tools, money, resource, all of that, obviously, to take the opportunity to use some of the regulatory initiatives to help as a business enabler. And obviously we're going to say this because we're tech firms, but think about the fact that the regulator has said they're becoming data-led. They have a 3-year project at the FCA. They have £120 million earmarked for the data development that they're doing. They are building a team of very bright data scientists who are going to slice and dice and analyse and try and work out where the next risks are arising. The less tech-enabled firms are, the more old-fashioned legacy systems they have, it's going to make it really, really difficult. So I think there is a point here where firms have to have a look at what they're doing, what's on offer in the market, why Regtech is moving forward as such a big topic as it has done in this last couple of years. That's for a reason, and that's because of the value that it adds. So it's thinking about how firms like us can work with firms like you to help you with your business cases, to help you with identifying how Adrian's firm and our firm can do all sorts of things probably that you wouldn't even imagine that we could do in helping manage and mitigate some of the conduct and culture risks that you run.
And I would add to that, Julie and Adrian, that to move from a 7 to 8, like we saw in the first poll question there, to a 9 to 10, that many of the firms who are 9 to 10 are embracing these 4 key points here to actually get them into a different place on that journey map towards achieving not only regulatory expectation, but bottom line results, Adrian.
I'm cutting out a bit, Philip. I'm terribly sorry. I'm just going to build a bit on Julie's comment about looking at whether or not regulation is a tax on your business or whether it's actually a force for good. And I think those firms that can look at regulation as a force for good will achieve the sorts of cultures that the regulators are looking for.
And we talked about on this webinar meeting changing expectations on the left hand side, but increasingly boards are on board, I would say, because it's not only a profit motive, even when we're talking about D&I, but we're also talking about reputational risk issues when we're talking about operational resilience and resilient cultures. And at the end of the day, when we talk about fit and proper and taking reasonable steps, we all want, and as many senior managers on this webinar want to sleep easy, don't we? As regulated firms and SMF holders, and I think that technology brings that opportunity to bear when we don't want people working off Excel spreadsheets or necessarily addressing learning the same way they did 20 years ago, but using the technology in a way that is appropriate, which is suitable, which is personal, but also which is accountable. And that is what the regulator now expects. And as you said, Julie, the shifting expectations of the regulator means to say there must be a shifting expectation and intention from firms to actually do things slightly differently, but also build on the great work that they've been doing over the last 10 or if not five years there. But as we come into land we've got a number of quotes here where Regtech, and it's not the new thing, Regtech, as you know, but Julie, you put these slides together as quotations really to actually help firms map their journey and support their journey in alignment with regulatory adherence. Do you want to just speak a little bit about this?
Yeah, well, this was just a bit of work that we've done around the projects that we've ran. And it was really interesting when you started to talk to people about the feeling. I said something like, I think the words I said on one of our earlier webinars were, we get an opening of a cultural window every time we work with a firm in Regtech, and there are many different reasons that people choose to do it. We particularly like it when people do it because they want to do it and they want to use Regtech to not just meet a regulatory requirement, but help improve their business, manage risks, mitigate risks, and for operational efficiencies. And these are some of the things that they said to us, and it just struck me how interesting it was that actually Regtech influences culture, because Regtech allows people to effectively do their jobs better as long as it's well specced and good tech like EDF's tech and our tech, and we know what we're talking about in a regulatory perspective. But it's just fascinating that look what it does in terms of how it makes people feel, how it feels about the culture in the organisation, and how great it feels to be given the tools to do the job that they know is going to make a difference in what they need to give back to the organisation. And it struck me so much that I thought it was appropriate to just share it.
And I think it's right to share that. And what we've done on the poll question, the last poll question, is actually indicate the opportunity to test drive and demo the opportunities that both are called, which is the SMCR software that Worksmart provide, and also the Elephants Don't Forget learning offering that they provide, AI powered learning offering, and just to really support you in your culture and conduct journey in 2022. Also, you can access our range of blogs and podcasts and webinars, that just like this one, this fantastic webinar. And thank you very much indeed for the interaction, because that's been really participative and inclusive of how we can learn from yourselves, as well as us imparting information to you there. Final thoughts, Adrian and Julie, on supporting firms in 2022. Crystal ball time. What's going to change? What's going to be different in your world, and in supporting regulated firms achieve their culture and conduct objectives?
I think I better go first on this one, because I can see Adrian's typing an answer to a question we had, which was a very interesting one. And that one, what are the drawbacks of tech that we should be aware of? I'll let Adrian carry on typing that one, and I'll go first on this. So I actually think it's going to be, the regulator is reorganizing itself at the moment. You've probably heard lots of stories about changes at the regulator as a result of the new leadership team, and they are going to be focused very much on, as I say, this data and data analysis, but in the context of your organization. They are trying to improve how they collect data, and the data requests that are all the ad hoc ones that make it so very difficult for firms to be constantly completing data. So I think there's going to be more discussion with the industry about how they move that forward for the benefit of everybody. There is going to be a huge focus on diversity and inclusion, people doing the right thing, purposeful cultures, and just, I guess, all of the things that we've talked out on this webinar. Just expect more of the same. Yes.
And yeah, we've packed an awful lot in this webinar, and I'm conscious that people are asking and requesting the slides already, and the recording of this webinar, thankfully, that will be with you by the end of the week, so you can review this as well. Also, we've cited a number of links and referenced a number of speeches and presentations from various sources, from both the FCA and also from law firms as well. We will populate that as much as we can if that supports you there. And please let us know your feedback on webinars such like this. Has this been good, useful, same of the same, or just what the doctor had ordered? Because it'll be really grateful for your feedback. That's improving our culture and our conduct within our respective firms. But thank you very much indeed for your comments and your participation in this webinar. And thank you indeed. And let us know how you are tracking in your journey, and see if we can actually help you and support you move from the lower numbers on that first poll to the higher numbers on the polls there. And yeah, let's keep on sharing. Let's keep on actually pushing the envelope there as well. Thank you very much for your time today, and have a great afternoon.